The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute Fellow 2022, Julián Castro.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our fifth and final session of Time to Do Things Differently, Getting Beyond Policy Silos to Boost Economic Mobility. We saved a very special session for last. I'm very proud to have as a guest today someone who has been very inspiring for me, and I know for so many other folks around this country, who has been a public servant for years now, having served on the Boston City Council from 2010 to 2019 as an at-large member. And during that time, being the top vote getter across the city a couple of times. And since 2019 has served as the Congresswoman for Massachusetts' 7th Congressional District, which includes parts of Boston, Cambridge, Milton. She is dynamic, she is progressive, she is principled. She also has focused a lot of her energy and attention on ensuring that those who are too often left behind, the most vulnerable in our country, that their needs are addressed. And that's one of the reasons that I'm particularly excited about our conversation today. I am very happy to welcome to American University Sine Institute, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley.
Wonderful, thank you, Mr. Secretary. And indeed, it is always a joy to be in community with you, even if it's just sitting at a virtual table. I look forward to when we can return to being in beloved community with one another in person. But certainly your leadership example has been a source with which I derive great clarity and strength and inspiration. And so I thank you for your example, and I thank you for your friendship. And, you know, I think the most important thing about me that probably my entire bio could really just be one line, and that is that I am Sandy Pressley's daughter. My mother, may she rest in peace and power, raised me alone, while my father, who is a brilliant man and is doing great today, but cycled in and out of the criminal legal system because of substance use disorder, which was criminalized. And his substance use disorder and the criminalization of that destabilized our household in many ways. And my mother just fought fiercely to ensure that I never be denied or deprived any opportunity in life. And was an incredible role model of community building and movement building and civic engagement, and taught me early on that in life there's a difference between your job and your work. She worked many jobs to make ends meet, everything from being a tenants' rights organizer through the Urban League of Chicago, where I'm originally from, to being a social worker with an emphasis on young people and elder abuse, to being an executive secretary for a patent law firm, even a slot attendant on a casino boat in New York many years later. So she worked many jobs to make ends meet. But she told me the difference between your job and your work. Your job is what pays the bills, and your work with a capital W is the work of the upliftment, the advancement, and the betterment of community. And so, that is the charge that I've had my entire life, inspired by her righteous representation and example. And the other thing that she poured into me early on is that to be Black is a beautiful thing and something that I should be proud of, but that I was being born into a struggle. And she had an expectation that I would do my part in that struggle. And that is the work of how I would characterize it as the work of Black liberation, but really the liberation of all marginalized people. And as you alluded to, prior to my election in Congress, I served on the Boston City Council for 8 years. And the city of Boston, which the Massachusetts 7th calls home, is a vibrant, diverse, and dynamic district, and one of the most unequal in our country. And in fact, the most unequal in our congressional delegation, where in a 3-mile radius from Cambridge, Harvard Square, to Roxbury, Nubian Square, the Blackest part of my district, life expectancy drops by 30 years and median household income by $50,000. And I know that that is the result of decades of not just divestment and under a resourcing of community, but very precise and draconian policy choices that I would consider to be policy violence, like redlining, which have resulted in these structural inequities, which have created these disparate outcomes. And so the reason why I ran for Congress is because I felt that the district had changed, the needs of the district had changed, and I wanted to be precise in legislating equity, healing, and justice in the same way that we have legislated hurt and harm. And then the last thing that I would just say, because I was lifting up your inspiring representation, one of the things that's always lobbied against women candidates and candidates of color is this charge of identity politics. And I've never asked anyone to vote for me because I'm Black or I'm a woman. There are many parts that make up my identity. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a survivor, sometimes a poet, but identity does matter. And as the first person of color to ever represent the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the US House of Representatives, that took 230 years to break that concrete ceiling. And the first woman of color, first Black woman to serve on the Boston City Council, that took 100 years to break that concrete ceiling, which surprises a lot of people given the progressive, bona fides and merit of Massachusetts. But I think we have lagged for a very long time in leadership parity, and we've now made great strides. But the reason why that matters is not just for moments of kumbaya, to sort of pat ourselves on the back about all the progress we've made. Symbolism is powerful and that matters, but it's how it shows up in our policies, Mr. Secretary. And I'll just close here with an example of that. My first budget hearings as a city councilor, I asked every city department and agency that came before me, what are you doing for the girls? Because so much of their emphasis on how to address community-based violence or the achievement gap, unemployment, so many other things was focused on how at and proven risk our Black and brown boys are. And I felt girls had been completely erased from the narrative and they were growing up in the same circumstance. And so, I asked, what are you doing for the girls? And I had run on a platform and a campaign to champion gender specific and responsive programming and policies. And they barely had a monosyllabic response. But by the second budget cycle, they came with cross-tab, multicolored binders because I knew that someone would call the question. And so that is the work that I seek to do every day, is to call the question. And it's important that we have a government, in order for it to be by the people, it must be fully representative of the people. Because if we are championing issues or developing solutions through a completely monolithic and homogenized prism, we do a disservice to everyone. When I was first elected to the Boston City Council, people would often ask, prior to your election, who was hurting the most, women or Black people? Or the Black community? And I said, everyone. we do a disservice when we don't have a diversity of perspective, opinion, and lived experience in the corridors of power and around policy and decision-making tables. So I'll stop there and just say policy is my love language. And I'm very humbled that every day I get to do that work with clarity and with intention.
No, and you have had already an amazing career in public service that has been very inspiring. And I want to ask you about that because I think you gave a great example. As somebody who has served on the city council myself, I know that the impact that a person's voice and input can make in local decision making. And we've just been through a pandemic where the most vulnerable people have been hit the hardest, and our Black and brown communities have been hit very hard, including in places like Boston and the places that you represent. And at the same time, just in the last few days, we got the news that Elon Musk bought Twitter as another example of the impact of this billionaire class in our country and our world. And it highlighted the growing inequities in our nation, in our world. How do you feel like, compared to the local level, that at the federal level, you're able to call that question and able to make an impact? Where do you find the opportunities to make an impact at the federal level compared to the local level?
Well, I think it's been a tremendous gift having served on the Boston City Council, addressing many tough issues around social, economic, racial, and gender justice on a micro level, and still bringing that perspective and doing this work on the federal level. But also having been an aide for 16 years, 4 in the House, 11 in the Senate, serving on the City Council, how critical these relationships are at every level of government. And so sometimes the city and the state are the pace setters, and I can take my cues from them federally as a legislator and what I'm advocating for from an appropriations and budgetary standpoint. And sometimes it goes the other way. So one example, 2 quick ones that I could offer. I'm an original co-sponsor of the Crown Act to ban race-based hair discrimination in our learning communities and in the workplace. That has passed the House. It has not been brought to the floor in the Senate. And, given some perpetual obstruction that we have faced there, I don't know if it will come to the floor anytime soon. But the Commonwealth of Massachusetts just became the 15th state in the country to pass the Crown Act. And so, there are ways in which we mimic. In terms of another issue where you see sort of that partnership, I would say on student debt. This is an issue that people really try to marginalize. A $2 trillion crisis affecting people from every walk of life, millennial and Gen Z, with an inability to invest in or start a business, or to purchase a home, or to consider starting or expanding a family. Seniors in my district, 76 years old, on fixed income, still paying on student loans. Educators in my district who wanted to be educators, wanted to be, as President Obama often called them, nation builders, and incurred a great deal of debt to do that. And now, because they can't afford the monthly minimum on those loans, given the cost of living in Boston, risk losing their licensure to teach for those reasons. And then finally, parents who took out Parent Plus loans, have co-signed loans for their kids, and are getting up in age and can't even afford to retire. So this is a nearly $2 trillion crisis, one that people tried to marginalize. And as we were championing the need for student debt cancellation, people would counter that it was regressive in impact. It would only benefit white graduate students who went to affluent schools, or, I paid my loans, why can't you pay yours? When the cost of higher education has increased by some 150%. And, Black and brown folks, marginalized communities, were told forever education in this so-called meritocracy that we live in is life's great equalizer. And they thought that more of us getting into institutions of higher learning would narrow the racial wealth gap, Mr. Secretary, but it has in fact only grown it, because this is a student borrower burden disproportionately bore by Black and brown students. And so using Twitter and this platform and working with partners on the city and state level, we have really amped up the visibility and the full narrative of who's impacted by this burden and this crisis. And so 3 times we've been successful in getting the administration to pause those student loan payments. And I've heard from people during this pandemic, they've been able to remain safely housed, to purchase essential goods. Some people became first generation home buyers, which is also very critical to closing the racial wealth gap. So, Mr. Secretary, if we've seen this sort of transformative impact in a 2-year period, imagine what could happen with broad-based student debt cancellation by executive action requiring no vote or action of Congress. Unilaterally, President Biden has the authority to do this. It's an economic justice issue, racial justice issue, and I think will be an effective strategy to jumpstart the economy as we come out of this pandemic-induced recession. And so I would just say, stewarding responsibly my platforms, working with people on every level of government, and most of all, centering the people who have been impacted by this burden. We now see that we are closer than ever before, given announcements by the White House, even in the last 36 hours, to seeing a broad-based student debt cancellation at some level. And of course, I'm asking, along with Leader Schumer and Senator Warren and Rep. Omar and others, for $50,000, because that will help 80% of those in the lowest income brackets, our most vulnerable. So we don't know at what level, but we're closer than ever to seeing that happen.
Absolutely. And I think what you're referring to is that Biden had sat down in the last couple of days with the Hispanic caucus and made a comment about intending to do away with all or almost all of student loan debt. And of course, that invited many questions from folks. And because of your advocacy and the advocacy of Senator Warren and Leader Schumer and others, he does seem to be moving more in the direction of doing something more expansive and definitive on this issue.
Well, it's not only transformative, sound, and smart policy. Heading into the midterms, I'll just be transparent and say I also believe it's good politics. Yeah. This is just simply about being responsive to the needs of this multi-generational, multiracial coalition, which made this Democratic majority possible. So those are the sorts of policies that I champion, those that are transformative and that are responsive to the needs of the people, especially and including our most vulnerable. This is why we need to do things like make the child tax credit permanent. Economists have characterized that as the greatest piece of anti-poverty legislation, in modern times. And when we had that temporary child tax credit, we know how impactful that was for people. And that's what what I want, Mr. Secretary, is for people to feel it so tangibly, so apparent to them that we are fighting for them. They're okay if we lose a fight, as long as they see us go down fighting. If we don't get the outcome we sought, but that they feel tangibly the impact of their government all around them, so they don't have to question. If we see them, if we are doing everything possible to not only meet their most basic needs, but to ensure that they can thrive. And that's why I fight for everything from combating this Black maternal morbidity crisis, to canceling student debt, to making the child tax credit permanent, to growing Black home ownership, which is the lowest now than it's been in 6 decades since the FHA was introduced, to my advocacy on issues like long COVID. We see a growing community of COVID long haulers, disproportionately in those most marginalized communities, because our communities were hardest hit. And as you said, I want to take on those communities and those issues that are often ignored, left out, and left behind. And I want to make sure that this COVID long hauler community is not left behind when it comes to our public health response, which is why I've introduced legislation to that effect. Yeah,
and Representative, I know that you take your job there very, very seriously, and you have votes coming up at 3:40 Eastern, and know you're going to be in place to go vote. And so we have about until that time, and I'm going to turn it over to our 2 student associates, Ruby and Manasi, in a second for the student Q&A. But before that, I mean, you've inspired so many folks, and I think that a lot of our students can relate to your desire to be in public service and are inspired by your story. We have students who are watching. What advice would you give to them if they want to get involved and maybe go into politics or be impactful in some way?
That you belong everywhere. You belong everywhere, in every corridor of power, around every policy and decision-making table where decisions are being made about you. And certainly there are many other ways with which to, engage civically and in public policy, outside of running for office or being a super voter. I certainly thoroughly enjoyed being the person behind the person for 16 years. And I think a lot of people underestimate the power that you can wield and the influence you can have in being the person at the elbow of the person, writing the policy. So what I would say is just know that you belong everywhere, take up space. And I do feel compelled to say this, just being a deeply spiritual person as well, Mr. Secretary. I think on the front line of these fights, especially when, coming from marginalized communities, I think our whole identity can become that of being these sort of resistance warriors, and we can extinguish our own humanity. And of course, I think great harm in the form of policy violence has been done to marginalized people because people don't see our humanity. So I really just want to challenge us, particularly on the heels of this pandemic, to continue to be radical and bold in the work of organizing and of policy making, but also hold comparable space for your radical joy and healing. And I feel compelled to say that because I fear that the second pandemic is going to be trauma. And I really want to make sure we have a trauma-informed recovery. And we just have, faced unprecedented hardship these last 2 years plus. And so that's what I would just offer to everyone. Do not forget to center your own humanity in the midst of doing this very meaningful and rewarding work. And just know that you belong everywhere.
Those are wonderful words of wisdom, and I think well taken by our students. And we were very lucky to have some great student associates that have helped throughout this seminar series. Today, Ruby and Manasi are taking the lead on the student Q&A, which we'll have for about 12 or 13 minutes, and then make sure that you can get to your votes there
Okay.
on Capitol Hill. So I'll turn it over to Ruby and Manasi.
How's it going, Representative Pressley? I just want to say thank you for those words about you belong everywhere. I know that definitely hits for me as a woman of color hoping to go into the political field. So the first question we have for you is about your role in politics, and you're part of this fabled squad, as you are affectionately called, of powerhouses of women in Congress. But how do you balance your social influence in this squad and your political influence? Because your role as you're almost like an influencer in politics, but also a working politician. So how have you balanced that?
Well, I'm touched that you said affectionately referred to as, because more often than not, we our experience is that that descriptor of the squad is often weaponized, and we did not call ourselves the squad. This is very much a media construct. Our sisterhood is real. The kinship and alignment that we have from values and policy is real. The unique joy and pain of being a first and what comes along with that, when you are the first woman in your seat, or the first person of color, the first Muslim. So our sisterhood transcends the politics, and I'm fortunate that we get to be partners in much of the work that we do. So in terms of the influencer piece, I hope that what I am is a responsible steward. I feel a great responsibility, in having such a big platform. And as I said, I've used it as a tool to do things like build consensus, or elevate consciousness around an issue, because it is that social discourse which can directly influence public policy. I've used, this platform and this influence to organize, to mobilize, to educate, and I hope ultimately also to inspire. So, but I never lose sight of who sent me here and what my priority must be. And so you will not see me on a late night couch or on cable news unless it is affording me the opportunity to speak to an issue of consequence to the people that I represent or the most marginalized. And so I'm very intentional in that way.
Thank you so much for
Thank you so
answering.
much.
Yes, so we have another question from a student that I think is especially relevant to what you were saying about your work on the Boston City Council and then transitioning to Congress. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a little bit of the similarities between serving on the city council of a major city like Boston versus working in Congress. I'm sure there are some similarities, but I'm also sure there are definitely some surprises as well and things that you maybe didn't expect. And is there any moment that, particularly sticks out to you from, some of your first weeks and months in Congress and how that kind of shaped how you moved forward in your position?
Well, I did previously, in serving on the Boston City Council, that is technically a legislative body, albeit 13 members. However, we have a strong mayor form of government. And so, although I was very vigilant and very creative, and we were able to have an impact on many things, everything from, getting a comprehensive sex and health education curriculum adopted as a part of the wellness policy, to reforming the state's liquor license laws to grow the number of licenses in marginalized communities so that we could have restaurants and walkable amenities, to many other issues that I could list. But ultimately, your ability to advance things was about getting the consensus from your colleagues, but then the support of the mayor. It's a strong mayor, form of government, and again, a 13-member body. So you're closest to the people, and it's very easy to get access to a colleague, to try to not persuade them, but enlist their support in something, and sometimes persuade them if they were at first glance not into whatever it is that you were doing. In Congress, this is a 436 member body, and it is much harder, just given the sheer size, given the polarization. And then I would say the biggest blind spot that I had is the impact of traveling. This is, a lot of people still don't get, and I have to remind them, I'm in Washington Monday through Friday. So I am away from my district, my community. I'm away from my husband, my daughter, our cat. Shout out to our cat, Sojo. Her name is Sojourner Truth Pressley Harris, because everybody in our house it does the work of abolition in one way, shape, or form. But her nickname is Sojo. But so I'm away from my district, my community, and my family Monday through Friday. And when I go back and I'm in community, you realize all the more how there's a disconnect oftentimes between what is happening in Washington and how that's actually being metabolized and understood in the district. So I think, those have been some of the challenges, is like a body that's much smaller to a body that's much bigger, living in two different cities. And it's just a lot more challenging if you and a colleague don't see eye to eye, and you need to enlist their support in order to get a bill out of committee into the floor for a vote, to access them, just given, the sheer nature of the demands. I'm a to-do list person. And one of the first things I had to learn in that transition from being an aide to being an elected, and the difference between being an activist and an elected, is that as an activist, you get to choose what you work on. So you could say, I really want to focus on just Haiti, or I just want to focus on Title 42. You get to just pick. But when you're an elected official, you have those things that you're most passionate about. You have those things that you want to advance to be responsive to the needs of the people, but you're also having to respond in real time to a bunch of things that maybe felt a lesser priority to you or that you had not even considered. There's no way that I could have predicted that I would be governing when I first came in the midst of a government shutdown, that our Democratic majority-led House would twice impeach a president, that we would be in the midst of a global pandemic, or now in the midst of a war. So those have been some of just the real-time adjustments that I've had to make to build that muscle.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You were talking about balancing the relationship between like your city and your federal position. So on that note, what do you think the relationship between local and federal politics should be? Like how do you see them working together well, and what do you see the challenges of those two bodies connecting?
Yeah, you have to be super intentional about it. And like I said, I think I have an advantage having served on the city council for 8 years, so I know just how hard they work. And I also have a lot of pre-existing relationships. And so I've been very intentional about cultivating that thought leadership and policy partnership with my colleagues on the municipal and state level. So our city councilors, our mayors, and our state reps and our state senators. And that has been very critical, particularly in the midst of a pandemic. And now as we head into the recovery of a pandemic-induced recession and want to make sure that we not return to a pre-COVID unjust status quo normal, but that we are in fact charting a different path forward, those relationships become really key. So I think it's just about being intentional. And then, I do things like, I co-chair the House Haiti Caucus, and I represent the third largest Haitian diaspora in the country. I have a huge Black immigrant community, but Haitian specifically, third largest Haitian diaspora in the country is in the Massachusetts 7th. And so as I was championing the need for the administration to repeal Title 42, this Trump holdover policy that was resulting in the unjust deportations of many, but disproportionately Black immigrants and Haitian immigrants in particular, I went to several of these city councils in my district, Cambridge, Somerville, and Boston, and asked them to introduce resolutions calling for the repeal of Title 42. So even though they could have said, we're on the municipal level, this is a federal issue, they understood that our destinies are tied. We represent shared constituencies. This is a federal policy that is separating families and resulting in a lot of trauma for their constituents. And so they should take a stand. And a resolution is non-binding, it's not policy, but it's a value statement, And so those are some of the ways. And so that, that kept up the pressure. And so recently we've seen the administration agree to repeal Title 42. And I think that has everything to do with the fact that we were engaging impacted families, community, stakeholders at every level of government to keep banging the drum.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing about your work on that. I think we're going to pass you back over to Secretary Castro. I know you have to get off to your vote coming up. So thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank
you.
you.
Are you kidding me? Listen, I feel I'm bearing witness to greatness here, and I do honestly expect great things from each and every one of you, and I'm glad that I could be a part of your journey for 30 minutes here. So thank you for the invitation and the opportunity.
Yes, I want to echo your thanks. Thanks to Ruby and to Manasi for doing such a great job, and to all of our student associates throughout these sessions for being fantastic. Representative Pressley, it's great to see you, hopefully in person one of these days. We can spend a little time together, but we're so happy with the time that you've given us today to address this urgent issue of making sure that the most vulnerable in our country are well served by all of the federal investments and policies happening these days. thank you for continuing to fight the good fight. And we look forward to so much more impactful work that we know that you're going to keep doing in Washington.
Well, thank you. It's very
All right, then I'll let you get on to your votes. And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us over these past 5 sessions. I decided to focus my sessions as an AU Sine Institute Fellow on serving the most vulnerable because like all of you and many of you, I see that it's very clear these days that inequality has been growing tremendously in our country. We had, as I mentioned in our conversation, another reminder of that just a few days ago with Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter. For those of means in our country, these are times of possibility, of aspiration. But as we saw during the COVID pandemic and the recession associated with it, and we continue to see today for far too many people in our country, whether they work in fields or in grocery stores or meatpacking plants, or they are teachers or folks who work hard every day, the possibilities have become more and more limited. Housing affordability, economic security, security in retirement, all of those things are under great stress in our nation. And at the same time, after what we all just went through, after this COVID-19 pandemic, now more than ever, I believe that folks should recognize that we're all in this together. And I think that more people in a long time in our country do recognize that. That's why the moment is ripe to make transformational investments in everyday Americans. We've done some of that with the CARES Act, with the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure plan, and hopefully in the months to come, some pieces of Build Back Better. We have to keep doing that. But the point of these sessions was that it's not enough to put the money forward. We also have to reflect on some of the mistakes that have been made in the past at the state level, the federal level, and the local level in making sure that the most vulnerable actually benefit from those investments, that we do things differently, that we ensure that those housing dollars actually reach people who are extremely low income. We make sure that that child tax credit is as broad-based and impactful as possible, that we use economic development dollars not only to benefit big corporations, but also to ensure that small business owners are able not only to stay in business, but to thrive and to grow their business and one day to become bigger business owners. There's a lot to learn, and I hope that these sessions were educational, informative. I also hope that they were inspiring, especially to the students who had an opportunity to participate, because you're oftentimes told that you're the future, but you're not only the future, you're the present. You have an opportunity to use your voice to make a difference, and you're going to have an opportunity in the years to come in your own career and through your volunteer efforts and through using your voice and your talent to change things, to make sure that we do things differently, that we change policies, we change investments, and that the most vulnerable in our country are able to reach their dreams like anybody else. I think that that is part of the charge of this generation. And I hope that in some small way, these sessions have helped inspire you to help make that change one way or another, in big ways and in small ways in the years to come. I want to thank Amy Dacey and everybody at the Sine Institute for giving me this opportunity to serve as a fellow during this spring semester. It has been a tremendous pleasure. And the entire staff, Lanesa and Charles and the student associates have been fantastic. Thank you to the Sine Institute. Thanks to all of the American University community for being a part of these sessions. And let's change things in the years to come. Thank you.